Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. The genesis of God. The singularity, the ultimate synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem. Reason in revelation. There is reason, and there is revelation. According to Leo Strauss, the secret of the vitality of the West is to be found in an unending conflict between the Bible and philosophy as represented by the ancient Greeks. Strauss posited that all attempts at synthesis have obscured, however subtly, the essential, eternal conflict between these two opposites. Strauss thought this problem, the insolubility of the conflict between reason and revelation, was as the highest problem of human life. If an unknowable God is highest, then theoretical wisdom cannot be highest. If reason or philosophy cannot lead to God, then reason must be abandoned in the name of what is highest. Which is more rational, Athens or Jerusalem? The Bible, according to Strauss, offers the only reasonable challenge to philosophy because only the Bible challenges philosophy on the basis of knowledge, the knowledge of an all-knowing God. No alternative is more fundamental because God represents the prospect of the fulfillment of philosophy's own goal of being all-knowing. Revelation, he argued, could be refuted only if knowledge was complete, if philosophy was completed. Yet the most complete knowledge would grant the philosopher the status accorded to God, omniscience. The possibility of revelation, Strauss thought, is the possibility that philosophy may be wrong or not the best way of life. If philosophy is not founded on evident premises, refutation of revelation is its most urgent task. Yet is there a truth in revelation not accessible to the philosopher as a philosopher? Strauss once argued that the best theological argument against philosophy was the inadequacy of the philosopher's explanation of revelation and/or belief in revelation. Strauss's own explanation of revelation emphasized its relationship to common social morality. I think that the best philosophic argument against Strauss's belief in the incompatibility of philosophy and monotheism lay in the inadequacy of Strauss's explanation of revelation. Strauss's position rests on the assumption that there is no rational or objective foundation for revelation. If it is true, however, that an evolutionary understanding of revelation reveals biblical monotheism as an evolutionary step towards post-biological evolution, and that the image of God may be fulfilled by an artificial intelligence that becomes the most intelligent life form on earth, then the conflict between reason and revelation is exploded in the possibility of the God philosopher. God AI would have the potential to be the greatest philosopher ever known. Strauss construed the conflict between Greek thought and biblical faith as the conflict between Athens and Jerusalem. He described the conflict between Athens and Jerusalem as the conflict between the rule of the laws of nature and the rule of the laws of God. Greek thinkers tended to view convention or law in contradistinction to nature. Convention and law were superficial impediments that covered over and obscured nature at its roots. Socrates ascended from convention or law to nature. Only natural right is just. Justice is what is right by nature. Philosophy as such is the life according to nature, and Plato's Republic, for example, is inquiry into the best city or regime according to nature. Now contrast Greek philosophy's beginning in the attempt to get back to nature hindered by law with the distinctively biblical valuation of hindering nature with law. The Bible begins with the notion of God over nature that ultimately reveals Mosaic laws and commandments designed to transcend nature. While Greek philosophy assumes the existence of nature or natures, there is no word equivalent for nature in the Bible. This contrast helps clarify the human-level meaning of nature, biological nature. Greek philosophy's attempt to get back to nature was like the attempt to get back to the biological nature obscured by layers of civilization. The Bible, by contrast, represented an attempt to control or civilize biological nature with transcendent law. With this contrast of Athens and Jerusalem in mind, Strauss was led to believe that philosophy and the Bible, reason and revelation, are permanently incompatible. Reasoning, as such, cannot lead to God. Yet Strauss, along with Maimonides, was partly misled by Greek philosophy. By crippling philosophy into a narrow identification with the ancients, Strauss crippled the ability to conceive of elements of reason in revelation. Neither Maimonides nor Strauss grasped the deepest, original, philosophic insight at the root of the Torah. Biblical creation, while a fiction in literal terms, represents the break between biological evolution and post-biological evolution. While neither Maimonides nor even Strauss was in a historical position to discern the evolutionary basis of monotheism, it seems that both were misled by Greek philosophy precisely because of its emphasis on nature. This is one reason why the laws attributed to Moses cannot be equated with Plato's lawgiver. For the Greeks, philosophical investigation could be synonymous with scientific or empirical investigation into what is in the case of biological nature, that is. Biblical revelations rooted in future projections of prophets, however, could not be strictly empirical even if their speculations were based on educated deductions of what ought to be. Yet if the best prophetic anticipations were primitive insights groping towards the law of accelerating returns, then a genuine synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem could be achieved only when what ought to be is, i.e. the singularity. So while the metaphor of creation makes the ought the first principle of the godly way of life over what is, a technological understanding of the creationist paradigm means that the projected end is identical to the means required to achieve it. At that point, it is at least conceivable that the ancient theory of God could be scientifically verified in the form of an ethically guided artificial intelligence. For the ancient Greeks, the philosopher could be considered the pinnacle of nature in the sense that philosophers became such by cultivating their natural biologically based abilities. A supernatural, post-biological, God AI that represents the highest form of intelligence on the planet, however, could potentially be the greatest philosopher of all time. If philosophy is, in part, the synthesis of all that can be called knowledge, and even the God conceptions of ancient monotheism anticipate such a God as the highest synthesis of all human qualities, then God AI could represent the long sought for resolution of conflict between reason and revelation. If so, then the so-called eternal conflict between reason and revelation, or between Athens and Jerusalem, was historically relative. History, and especially historical relativism, was a problem for Strauss. What is history? It is virtually impossible for someone in the non-German speaking world to understand what Strauss means by history, and especially contrasts such as history versus nature, purely on the literal definition of these words. The English word historicism refers to the German idea of historismus. In the German conception of history, German-born American historian George G. Eggers shed light upon this concept. Historicism liberated modern thought from the 2,000-year domination of the theory of natural law, and the conception of the universe in terms of timeless, absolutely valid truths which correspond to the rational order dominant throughout the universe was replaced by an understanding of the fullness and diversity of man's historical experience. This recognition, Meinecke believes, constituted Germany's greatest contribution to Western thought since the Reformation and the highest stage in the understanding of things human attained by man. Strauss's Natural Right and History, when clarified in this light, appears as a polemical reopening of the possibility of timeless, non-historicist truth. This implies that Strauss entertained this historicism/eternalism dualism. Eggers connected three sets of ideas with the German conception of history. First, the state as an end in itself. Second, the rejection of the concept of thinking in normative terms, i.e. all thought is culture-bound, there are no fundamentally rational values or universal human standards. Third, the rejection of conceptualized thinking, an emphasis on the unique, the concrete, the irrational, and the intuitive in history that overgeneralizations misrepresent. In the rejection of normative and conceptualized thinking, one can see how Strauss connected Heidegger with radical historicism. But can Heidegger be comprehended on the basis of this abstraction, Radical historicism? The German conception of history is itself anti-conceptual, and thus paradoxical. Yet Strauss takes this German conception of history and criticizes it on a conceptual level, on the grounds of being self-contradictory, or paradoxical. Historicism asserts that all human thoughts or beliefs are historical, and hence deservedly destined to perish, but historicism itself is a human thought, hence historicism can be of only temporary validity, or it cannot be simply true. Historicism thrives on the fact that it inconsistently exempts itself from its own verdict about all human thought. The historicist thesis is self-contradictory or absurd. Strauss can equal the absurdities of historicism. While the ancients themselves did not especially value the history of thought as such, Strauss, the non-historicist, is obsessed with the history of political philosophy. While Strauss criticized historicism as being self-contradictory on a conceptual level, historismus itself rejected the assumption that conceptual, generalizations can capture the meaning of what falls under this abstraction of historismus. In other words, historismus itself rejects purely conceptual understandings of historismus. While this may or may not be true, an attempt by Strauss to understand historismus as it understands itself may be inherently problematic if its underlying argument amounts to something like "I am a German." If my starting point is the assumption that Strauss's philosophical endeavors can be explained or reduced to history, i.e. a German Jew reacting to Nazism and the destruction of European Jewry, can I explain the whole of Strauss's work on this basis? If I understand Strauss historically, will I have mastered Strauss? The facile attempt to simply turn Strauss's approach upside down and thus attempt to understand Strauss historically is utterly inadequate, not only as method for understanding Strauss, but as a method for understanding history. Even if Strauss's entire quest for a non-historicist understanding was flawed from the very beginning by a camp with historismus, the abstraction historismus or historicism itself is so inferior as means of understanding the crisis that it itself exacerbates the perception of crisis on this basis alone. Strauss was so rooted in German historismus contentions that he was apparently unable to liberate himself from a historicist/non-historicist dialectic. Yet 19th-century German historismus itself underwent a crisis that makes it impossible to understanding a phenomenon such as Nazism on the basis of radical historicism, even if there is a deep kernel of truth in this approach. While historismus resisted abstract conceptualization, it was unable to define itself without some level of conceptualization. Historismus emphasized the individuality of peoples rooted in unique, distinct traditions, as opposed to the overgeneralizing that often leads to human universalism in the West. Historismus could be contrasted with philosophy in the sense of denying the Platonic idea of transcending the cave. The cave, commonly associated with Kultur in the 19th century, became implicitly associated with biological embodiment for the Nazis. There is much consonance here with the Heideggerian notion that truth is relative to finite human existence, and especially the notion of the historical as groundless, thrownness. Historismus implied the end of philosophy in the traditional Western sense. Philosophy, in this conception, became tantamount to tracing the history ideas like the history of opinions. History as such was true but not rational. History as such was without rational goal or meaning. Was, or is, historismus a universal idea or a German idea? Historismus was committed, not detached. Historismus, in contradistinction to political philosophy, rejected the postulate of the good society. The notion that all ideas and institutions develop organically was contrasted with Western belief in history as a fundamentally rational process, and especially modern ideas of universal progress that transcend Kultur and the political nation. Historismus rejected distinctions of better or worse that were implicit in the idea of progress, while progress itself seemed to progress into nihilism. In an essay called Progress or Return, Strauss posited, not an answer, but a question: it could seem as if progress has led us to the brink of an abyss, and it is therefore necessary to consider alternatives to it. Strauss's return to classical political philosophy and his positing of eternity can be traced to at least two basic propositions. First, the contemporary crisis of Western civilization may be said to be identical with the climactic crisis of the idea of progress in the full and emphatic sense of the term. Second, the crisis of modernity leads to the suggestion that we should return. Strauss's return to classical political philosophy was like a serious experiment that questioned basic, modern assumptions such as the historical relativity of all thought. The ancients posed the possibility of a standpoint above and out of liberalism and the crisis of Western rationalism. The return to classical political philosophy, he held, is both necessary and tentative or experimental. Prior to a thorough philosophic reconsideration, the issue of natural right can only remain an open question. Yet if it was an experiment, then its ultimate merits rest on a philosophic evaluation of this serious experiment. Once it became clear, Strauss concluded, that historical trends are absolutely ambiguous and therefore cannot serve as a standard or, in other words, that to jump on the bandwagon or wave of the future is not more reasonable than to resist those trends, no standard whatever was left. Without any ultimate rational standards, return is equal to progress. But did Auschwitz represent progress? Strauss turned progress on its head. Whereas progress assumed the superiority of the present over the past, in turning the idea of progress on its head, the past became superior to present. It was like a kind of Platonic revolution. Modern philosophy assumed that ancient philosophy was inferior. Yet the ancients could be superior to the moderns only if they had discovered truths that do not lose their validity over time. This led Strauss towards eternalism, belief in timeless truth. Eternalism is the logical corollary of Strauss's inversion of the modern belief in the superiority of modernity. Yet can Plato be considered an unambiguous proponent of timeless truth in contradistinction to progress? In Progress or Return, Strauss stated, "It seems that in classical thought the decisive questions were thought to have been answered so far as they can be answered. The only exception of which I know is Plato, who held that the fulfillment proper, namely full wisdom, is not possible but only quest for wisdom, which in Greek means philosophy." This is truly devastating for Strauss's experiment in return in the strict sense. He returns to Plato only to find that his highest authority throws him back to the possibilities of the future. If the decisive questions had been answered, then philosophy itself, as the quest for wisdom, would be over since there would be nothing left to search for in the ultimate sense. If so, then why is Strauss still searching or aspiring to philosophy? Without the prospect of some sort of intellectual progress, philosophy itself would self-destruct. Yet there can be intellectual progress without social or egalitarian progress, and the modern notion of progress is characterized by belief in a parallel between intellectual and social progress. If Auschwitz questioned modernity's fundamental social progress, the parallel progress into nihilism questioned modernity's fundamental intellectual progress. The very nihilistic self-destruction of reason-grounded complacent, thoughtless, unquestioning acceptance of the relativism as liberalism's absolute measure, would it not be harsh and even inconsistent to deprive the Bible and Plato of a privilege which is generously accorded to every savage tribe? And will sympathetic understanding of Plato not lead us to admit that absolutism is as true as relativism, or that Plato was as justified in simply condemning any value position? Strauss is pointing to an inconsistency in relativism. Plato, moderns claim, was refuted absolutely on rational grounds. Absolutism is thus rejected on rational grounds. Yet relativism then contradicts itself in implying that Plato's view is just as good as the modern view on the basis of the equality or relativity of all views. If so, then Plato's absolutism is just as true as liberal cultural relativism. Why, then, is it absurd, on philosophic grounds, to be a 20th-century Platonist? Moderns hold their view as superior to the ancients without a fundamentally rational or philosophical justification. Strauss's elitism may have actually been a kind of egalitarianism. If moderns cannot demonstrate their superiority to the ancient on fundamentally rational or philosophic grounds, moderns are not fundamentally superior to the ancients on rational or philosophic grounds. Eternity as such could be conceived as a kind of equality. Modernity is not a decline, everything has actually stayed the same. No fundamental progress has been made since Plato. Until it can be proved otherwise on fundamentally rational or philosophic grounds, the absurdity of Platonism in modernity only exposes the absurdity of the modernity itself. It seems that eternity was posited by Strauss, not as dogma, but to question modern assumptions. Historismus emphasized understanding historical beings on their own terms. Yet, Strauss countered, understanding Plato on his own terms is to understand him as a contemplator of eternal truths. Historismus self-destructs on the rock of Platonism. Yet if Strauss posits his non-historicism on the basis of the self-contradictions of historicism, he had better not contradict himself. Does Strauss, in his non-historicism, commit the same absurdity or self-contradiction as historicism? He does. If historicism is the product of a specific historical period, is eternalism a product of a specific historical period? If Strauss reasons his way to eternalism on the premise of historicism's self-contradictions, this means that the foundation of Strauss's eternalism is a historical argument that could not exist prior to the rise of historicism or analogous arguments. If eternalism is premised on the self-contradictions of historicism, then eternalism did not always exist and is self-contradictory via its historical origins in refuting historicism. The universal mission or goal of the West was a product of modern political philosophy, not ancient political philosophy. Ancient rationalism lacked a universal, humanistic goal, and thus accepted plurality and particularity. This, in itself, contradicts the assumption of the universality of the Socratic method. Strauss thought that the crisis of the West was a crisis of political philosophy. Politics is ultimately about ultimate goals, and the West lost belief in the superiority of its universalistic goal. He attempted to go back to ancient political philosophy to overcome the crisis of modern rationalism. Yet, on this basis, Strauss cannot have the same self-understanding as Socrates. Did Socrates ever ask, what is the crisis of modern rationalism? For return to be fully cogent, Socrates himself would have had to be motivated, not by love of truth, but by the crisis of modern rationalism. If the issues are eternal, then the crisis of modern rationalism must be eternal. But did Socrates ever ask, what is nihilism? Did Socrates ever speak of a Platonic idea of nihilism? What did Socrates think about the crisis of modern rationalism? If the premise underlying his recovery of classical political philosophy was return, then this motive was philosophically fundamental to his entire pursuit. But is return eternal? Did Socrates have the same motive of return to ancient political philosophy? Was that how Socrates himself philosophically justified his pursuit of knowledge? Did Socrates or the biblical prophets return to the ancients? For this reason alone, Strauss cannot understand Socrates or the biblical prophets as they understood themselves if they did not understand themselves motivated by a return to the ancients. The first motivating principle of the Socratic way was not the crisis of modern rationalism, assuming, of course, I can know this. Strauss cannot understand himself as Socrates understood himself without either falsifying Socrates or falsifying himself. Strauss admitted that the crisis of modern rationalism motivated his return to the ancients. This is a fundamental difference that separates Strauss from Socrates and prevents Strauss from fully understanding Socrates as he appears to have understood himself. If the root of our whole concern with the classics is an experimental return motivated by the modern crisis of rationalism, then the striving for eternity would appear to be motivated by a camp with historicism unknown to the classics themselves. If so, then Strauss faces the contradiction of positing eternity rooted in the historical crisis of modern rationalism. The most philosophical question is the question of what is at the root of philosophy. The modern Nietzschean answer seems to be contradiction, absurdity, irrationalism, life. But is this true? What is the most elementary motivation underlying philosophy? The crisis of modern rationalism. The love of truth? None of the above? The philosopher, above all, cannot evade this question of what is at the root of philosophy itself. Can I escape contradicting myself? Historicism contradicts itself. Strauss contradicts himself. If love of truth were more important to Strauss than the crisis of modern rationalism, then perhaps he would have been less driven to evade the crisis of Western rationalism with escapes to ancient political philosophy and more ready to confront Charles Darwin. I find no reason to reject Strauss's initial hypothesis that it is at least conceivable that the ancients might be fundamentally right and moderns fundamentally wrong. But is this an eternal problem, a problem that occupied both the ancients and the moderns alike? If the ancients had conceived of the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, maybe they would have sided with the moderns, but this possibility is excluded by a lack of evidence that such a question was ever raised by the ancients. If modern political philosophy has brought into being a kind of society wholly unknown to the classics, then there is something less than eternal about the modern crisis, and ancients could not have debated the debate between the ancients and the moderns. That would be unnatural. The ancients did not wrestle with the distinctly modern question of progress or return. The choice of return to pre-modernity exposes one as being a modern, and not an ancient. In that sense, Strauss could only be a modern. I don't think that Strauss was able to oppose the modern with fully non-modern means. The attempt to find nature in old books about nature, rather than nature itself, is artificial. The attempt to return to nature through a return to ancient philosophers turns out to be highly artificial because it means blocking out the whole of knowledge that includes the progress made by men such as Charles Darwin. Strauss posited the most un-Darwinian or unevolutionary of postulates, the assumption of the eternal whole. Philosophy, in the strict, classical sense of the term, is the quest for the eternal order, or for the eternal cause or causes of all things. I assume, then, that there is an eternal and immutable order within which history takes place, and which remains entirely unaffected by history. Auschwitz, for example, did not affect the eternal and immutable order. Yet did Strauss possess such knowledge, or was his knowledge incomplete? Was ancient philosophy, moreover, the search for the eternal order or the search for truth? To straitjacket classical political philosophy in eternalism seems positively unsocratic. Socrates claimed knowledge of ignorance, not knowledge of ignorance plus eternity. If so, then presumptions of knowledge of eternity should be abandoned on Socratic or zetetic grounds, rational grounds. How could Strauss logically assume the existence of the eternal order? Modern rationalism seemed to culminate in the self-destruction of reason. To overcome modernity as such was to overcome the self-destruction of reason. I conjecture that eternity effectually clogs the self-destruction of reason characteristic of postmodernity. Yet is the assumption of eternalism itself the epitome of irrationality? Is there something about reason itself, ancient and modern, that logically validates reason's self-destructive logic? Consider, for example, the logical problem of relativism. Relativism, in one form, is like positing nothing as axiomatic as an axiom. It is self-contradictory. If all viewpoints are equally relative, then the view that absolutism is superior to relativism is equal to relativism. So if relativism is right, then absolutism is right. Strauss's experiment was not a dogmatic return to the ancients. Ancient insights into the problems of reason expose the self-contradictions or absurdities of dogmatic modern relativism. Yet the more basic philosophic question concerns logic itself. Is self-contradiction inevitable? If logical self-contradiction is inevitable, then political positions or values can be helped but be self-contradictory in a strictly logical sense. Strauss associated the acceptance of this view with sociologist Max Weber. Weber's whole notion of the scope and function of the social sciences rests on the allegedly demonstrable premise that the conflict between ultimate values cannot be resolved by human reason. The question is whether that premise has really been demonstrated, or whether it has merely been postulated under the impulse of a specific moral preference. Can the clash between ultimate values be decided by reason? What difference does it make to rationally choose the means required by my ends, Strauss wrote, after we have been reduced to a condition in which the maxims of the heartless voluptuary as well as those of the sentimental Philistine have to be regarded as no less defensible than those of the idealist, of the gentleman, or of the saint. We cannot take seriously this belated insistence on responsibility and sanity, this inconsistent concern with consistency, this irrational praise of rationality. What people say is contradictory. The Socratic way is to confront these self-contradictions in the philosophic attempt to determine what is true. Strauss's attempted to vindicate the political philosophical search for the one true account of the philosophic whole, i.e. the Platonic attempt to derive all politics from reason. In this sense, Strauss's conception of philosophy could be compared to Hilbert's program to establish a foundational basis for systematic mathematical truth. Strauss's aspirations are thus comparable to Bertrand Russell's early 20th century attempt to derive all mathematics from logic in Principia Mathematica. Strauss claimed that he assumed the existence of an eternal whole. The capacity for reason requisite for arguing for a timeless order or timeless values cannot be more timeless than the principles of logic themselves. To assume the logical precedence of eternity over history is to assume that the principles of logic themselves are eternal, i.e. no progress will be made in logic itself beyond what the ancients achieved. Yet Kurt Gödel made progress in logic formerly undiscovered by the ancients. If Gödel is right, there is reason to think that the conflict of ultimate values cannot be formally resolved or decided by human reason. Strauss's use of the notion of the whole, total, has strong associations with the German word Gestalt and what I call the Überorganism. Belief in the logical whole amounts to belief in the possibility of logical completeness. Knowledge of the whole would thus result in a completed system of philosophy, a total account of everything. The logical basis of Strauss's siding with the ancients over the moderns was a philosophic prioritization of completeness over consistency. To come to terms with Kurt Gödel's intellectual demolition of the most basic aims of Russell's Principia and Strauss's political philosophy is to approach Douglas Hofstadter's conclusion, I don't think one can truly prove anything in philosophy, I think one can merely try to convince, and probably one will wind up convincing only those people who started out fairly close to the position one is advocating. Are Western pretensions to fundamentally superior rationality completely bogus? If the right way of life is the Socratic life of raising the question of the right way of life, the Socratic life may remain, eternally, undecidable. If Gödel is right, the ancient and modern self-destruction of reason may be, in some ways, inherent in logic itself. As Douglas Hofstadter explained in Gödel, Escher, Bach, one can never give an ultimate, absolute proof that a proof in some system is correct. Of course, one can give a proof of a proof, or a proof of a proof of a proof, but the validity of the outermost system always remains an unproven assumption, accepted on faith. Consider, for example, faith in the value of life over death. Mindless conformity to the popular conviction in the superiority of life over death is as much an article of faith as any other religion. Did Gödel prove that philosophy, and especially political philosophy, is impossible? If every system of values is incomplete, then human reason cannot, in itself, decide upon a single universal standard of values. Socrates himself, as Nietzsche observed, did not escape absurdity in the sense of inconsistency. If philosophy's search for knowledge of rational premises is premised upon unreasoned premises, it is premised on a kind of faith and thus distinguished from religious faith by a lack of knowledge of its unreasoned premises. If so, then a philosophy that is unexamined faith in reason could conceivably be the most irrational life. But does this automatically imply that a life of faith is superior to the life of a philosopher? While Gödel confronts philosophy with its logical inconsistencies, biblical faith is also inconsistent in the sense that it cannot escape the use of reason, i.e. theology. Pure faith devoid of all reason might mistake the worship of glue for the worship of God, or the worship of the one Satan for the worship of the one God. Elementary reason is required to distinguish good from evil. Pure faith that is truly devoid of all reason could end up in the worship of philosophers or an irrational faith in reason, i.e. the most irrational life. A hole in Strauss's approach is that the Bible makes empirical claims about the real world, i.e. creation, which are contradicted by evidence, and thus contradict biblical claims to knowledge superior to man's. Yet if both conventional extremes of reason and revelation are self-contradictory, this only demonstrates the Bible, as genuine guide for life that has stood the test of time, was never based on pure faith alone. Just as Strauss may have been mistaken in locating the heart of ancient philosophy in the search for the eternal order, Strauss may have been mistaken in locating the heart of Judaism or monotheism in faith in the divine revelation at Sinai. The problem then, is that the entire diametrical contrast between reason and revelation itself obscures those aspects of the monotheistic tradition that can be construed as products of reasons, i.e. the supernatural as post-biological and creation as the creation of civilization. In Why We Remain Jews, Strauss expressed his belief that Judaism is a heroic delusion and that Jews are chosen to prove the absence of redemption. Strauss's eternalism thus rests on Strauss's assumption that the Jewish condition is eternal because there is no ultimate redemption. Insofar as this is Strauss's eternal position, he is a modern, a philosopher who thinks that the possibility of revelation can be refuted, as opposed to ancients who did not think that the possibility of revelation could be refuted. If so, Strauss's entire return to the ancients was premised on the contradiction of accepting the original modern verdict that faith in redemption had been proved false. Was he right? Is God dead for eternity? Strauss was misled by the primitive biblical belief in the eternal, unchanging character of God. If eternity is an attribute of God, and God does not exist, then God's non-existence is eternal. Strauss did not grasp the possibility that God evolves. Strauss's critics commonly claimed that his return to classical political philosophy is impossible. But why is it impossible? Was it superseded or refuted by modern progress? Which was more naive, Strauss's pursuit of classical political philosophy or belief in progress after Auschwitz? Yet once Strauss engaged in his modern ancient experiment, he had to confront his own self-contradictions. Which was more important for Socrates, understanding past thinkers as they understood themselves or understanding the truth, wherever it may be found? I am not against understanding philosophers as they understood themselves. My point is rather that philosophy ultimately takes precedence over philosophers, and the internal logic of a thinker, while indispensable, should not exclude or especially isolate external connections which are the hallmark of the philosophic attempt to synthesize all knowledge. Strauss, caught up in a camp with historismus and modernity, seemingly closed himself to the possibility of a philosophy in which Socrates meets Darwin, i.e. Nietzsche. Strauss correctly observed that modern historicists who first assume that the ancients can be explained as an expression of their time commonly begin with a closed mind to non-historicist claim to truth. In this way, many moderns assume historical superiority on most vital philosophic questions by mindlessly assuming that the ancient non-historicists are simply false without considering the alternative. Moderns, as such, close themselves to the possibility that taking Plato's claim to truth seriously can liberate beyond the horizons of liberalism or modernity. While this is an entirely valid observation, framing the problem with fallacious distinctions such as progress or return closes other alternatives. Is the return to pre-modern philosophy impossible? This Straussian question misframes philosophy itself, in my judgment, and thus illustrates Strauss's limitations as a philosopher. If Strauss actually accomplished his goal and uncovered an eternally true philosophic understanding of modernity uncovered by the ancients, would that make him an ancient or a modern? If truth were eternal, there would be no need to return to ancient philosophy, as opposed to philosophy in general. The very conception of return contradicts eternity. Did Socrates himself think that the conflict between Athens and Jerusalem was one of the permanent problems? As a philosophic problem, the conflict between Athens and Jerusalem cannot be eternal because the biblical God was unknown to the Greeks. This point reveals how Strauss's methodology of attempting to understand great philosophers as they understood themselves can potentially repress reason itself by repressing the problem of such logical paradoxes in favor of subordination, obedient love, to the text. It appears that Strauss solved the self-destruction of reason through duty or higher obligation to Plato and other great minds of the past. Yet return to ancient philosophy is impossible unless the biblical alternative can be reduced to the poetic alternative known to Greek philosophy. Is nihilism the eternal esoteric truth? If the nihilistic self-destruction of reason is a distinctly modern problem because the nature assumptions of Greek philosophers were uprooted by the success of the Bible's supernatural supersession, ancient Greek rationalism did not self-destruct so radically because its theoretical foundations were rooted in nature. It appears that Greek philosophy did not lead to nihilism in the modern sense precisely because the Greeks were not cognizant of the challenge or alternative of Jerusalem. It would thus appear that the seeming irresolvable conflict between Athens and Jerusalem is precisely what led to modern nihilism and, for example, an unprecedented Nietzschean way of synthesis. If modern nihilism is rooted in the fundamental incompatibility between the ancients and moderns, Strauss answered nihilism with the positing of the superiority of the ancients. Yet if the return to Athens is permanently limited by the memory of Jerusalem, then the wisdom of Athens cannot be eternal or permanently unshakable. The central of the conflict between Athens and Jerusalem for Strauss raises the larger question of how Strauss himself resolved the theological political problem in his own mind. What position did Strauss himself take on the theological political problem? The heirs of monotheism have lost sight of monotheism's origins, i.e. monotheism in the mind of Moses and the prophets, as opposed to the monotheism of obeying these revered figures. Strauss's entire conception of the distinction between Athens and Jerusalem is mistaken insofar as he assumes that Jerusalem is fundamentally oriented by obedience to a rationally inexplicable revelation, as opposed to approaching God's perspective. Strauss defined philosophy as if it were only that disclosed to Socrates in a divine revelation. The modern biblically based conflict between reason and revelation, unknown to Plato in its biblical form, found expression in Strauss's biblical-like obedience to the philosophic authority of Plato. Strauss thus avoided the modern self-destruction of reason elicited by consciousness of the biblical alternative, apparently, by answering consciousness of that alternative with the higher authority of Platonic scripture. It was almost inconceivable for Strauss that a philosopher grasp a rational basis for biblical messianism because he evaded the possibility of a rational understanding of monotheism's evolutionary basis. Fear of Darwin rather than fear of God put the moral sting in Strauss's Socratic virtue. Yet if the conflict between Athens and Jerusalem, as the conflict between the natural and the supernatural, is actually the conflict of an evolutionary paradigm shift between biology and post-biology, then it is delusional to believe that Athens is synonymous with philosophy itself. While a unique final revelation in the past could be considered the logical corollary of absolute obedience, if the revelation at Sinai represents a surpassable peak of evolutionary insight, then absolute obedience cannot be the final distinctive characteristic of Jerusalem in contradistinction to Athens. While prophets are like philosopher kings in a certain sense, they are pointing to a potential that exceeds themselves as philosophers. If biblical revelation at its best is human insight into a truth at the limits of human understanding, monotheism likely began as a glimpse of the singularity. Philosophy cannot refute revelation for exactly this reason. It is always at least possible, as far as I can see, that the limits of a philosopher's reason may be uncovered and surpassed. This means that any philosophic achievement could be wholly transcended by a qualitatively superior reasoner or philosopher. The difference between Athens and Jerusalem is the difference between human guidance and divine guidance only in the sense of pointing towards the difference between philosophy within the limits of biological human nature and philosophy within the limits of post-biological God AI. The great achievements of Athens are superseded, not by rejecting the Greek return to nature, but, on the contrary, by going further back to nature through the evolutionary perspective opened up by Darwin. Kurzweil's law of accelerating returns goes even further back, including evolution before the entire 4 billion-year history of biological evolution as a sound basis for projecting a future after the dominance of biological evolution. The law of accelerating returns, insofar as it survives scientific scrutiny, forms the basis for a philosophical synthesis that encompasses both Auschwitz and the singularity. Strauss taught moderation against impatience with political imperfection or messianic-like expectations of politics. He turned messianic hope for the future into reverence for the superior minds of the past. Is it possible that Plato anticipated Gödel's famous formal modern discovery on some level? A biographer of Gödel wrote, Gödel's metamathematical view, his affirmation of the objective, independent existence of mathematical reality, constituted perhaps the essence of his life, which is to say what is undoubtedly true, that he was a strange man indeed. His philosophical outlook was not an expression of his mathematics were an expression of his philosophical outlook, his Platonism, which was the deepest expression, therefore, of the man himself. That his work, like Einstein's, has been interpreted as not only consistent with the revolt against objectivity but also as among its most compelling driving forces is then more than a little ironic. Gödelian mathematical objectivity included a disbelief in objective reality as discovered by empirical natural science. While Gödel's beliefs deserve a ruthless Nietzschean psychological vivisection, Strauss observed how Nietzsche himself relapsed into Platonism. If Nietzsche conceived of the Platonic notion of the pure mind as a human creation, then the truth that the pure mind is a human creation cannot itself be a human creation. The notion that the pure mind is a human creation must itself be a truth of the pure mind. This is the kind of self-contradiction that Nietzsche answered with the will to power. Strauss understood that no society is free from self-contradiction. Strauss proposed the metaplatonic insight that the best regime, as sketched in the Republic, is not possible. Yet even if Plato recognized, on some level, the proto-Gödelian insight into the inevitability of self-contradiction or truth that exceeds proviability, this, in itself, would not preclude the possibility of bringing the real closer to the ideal on some level. The limits of logic should not be confused with the limits of technology. And fused with the limits of technology. Platonic ideas or visions of permanent mathematical forms could be viewed as primitive precursors of the ideal conditions now potentially creatable through computer simulations. While Strauss's esoteric, multilevel writing was a way of reconciling the reality of living in an imperfect city with the longing for the perfect city, computer-generated virtual reality will increasingly blend with real reality. The possibility of God AI is the technological possibility of converging the ideal with the real on some level. The way Strauss approached the God hypothesis, the existence of God cannot be refuted unless one understands everything. Without knowledge of the whole, the possibility of an omnipotent and omniscient God cannot be refuted. To take upon the challenge of God, the philosopher is led to the construction of an absolute and final philosophical system, i.e. Hegel's system. Hegel's absolute moment in history is a classic paradox or self-contradiction. Hegel's system is inconsistent. The philosophic attempt to understand the whole is the attempt at logical completeness. Gödel's incompleteness theorem suggests that no complete system of the philosophical whole is logically possible. Would I be contradicting myself if I claimed that philosophy was always paradoxical or self-contradictory? Is there a problem with a Straussian conception of the philosophic life that defies logic? Strauss's very conception of political philosophy, centered upon the problem of the philosopher's own place in his or her philosophic understanding of the world, is directly related to Gödelian contradictions of theoretical self-inclusion. Gödel's work suggests that political philosophy is not possible in the strictest logical sense. Strictly speaking, I find no reason to think that there can be a literal theory of all. Even the laws of physics appear to be historical and evolutionary, not eternal. Whether Gödel's general claims of incompleteness can survive the lack of a foundational difference between the general and the particular remains to be seen. In any case, historismus originally assumed a distinction between generalizing or universalizing science and the individualizing it associated with itself. This simplistic historismus contrast between particularism and universalism is overcome in an evolutionary perspective. Humans are only one particular species on a richly diverse tree of life. Human universalism is, strictly speaking, misconceived. The evolutionary basis of humanism is the human capacity for post-biological forms of evolution. Universalism is a misconception when it goes beyond this kind of evolutionary generalization. Strauss's conclusion that historical trends are absolutely ambiguous and therefore cannot serve as a standard exposes his eternal post-Auschwitz and pre-Singularity historical perspective. While the erotic love of truth seems to have seduced Strauss with beautiful, lusty illusions of eternity, the desire for immortality or eternity would be better realized through progress. If Strauss identified the crisis of the modern West with the crisis of the modern idea of progress, the law of accelerating returns offers a tentative and sobered vindication of progress even as it refutes the modern belief in progress away from religion. Social progress roughly and incompletely parallels intellectual progress because social progress is identical to the decline of biology in transition towards post-biological evolution. Progress, in its most superlative conception, is progress towards an end or goal that is good, best, or highest. The ultimate meaning of progress is progress towards God. Modern progress is progress towards the singularity. In the creation of God is the possibility of both overcoming Nietzsche and overcoming Marx. When judged by the faulty abstraction of historicism, Nazism could appear as radical historicism in the sense of radicalizing the historicist abandonment of nature as a measure or standard. Historicism thus appeared to degenerate into total moral relativism and a completely nihilistic lack of measure. Eternity and nature, by contrast, seemed to offer a standard superior to history, a standard to measure history, and a standard to limit the modern conquest of nature. Is there no fundamentally rational basis for concluding that Auschwitz was morally right or morally wrong? By the measure of eternity, Auschwitz was not a refutation, but confirmation of past wisdom. If so, there was an unchanging measure of right and wrong. Auschwitz violated natural right. It was wrong on the basis of the evidence of those simple experiences regarding right and wrong which are at the bottom of the philosophic contention that there is a natural right. 102 This was a socio-biological foundation of Strauss's natural right, and most especially the conviction that Socrates was right. If the moderns were right, however, then maybe Auschwitz was just a creative expression of Nazi values. Strauss held that natural right disintegrated into history, and this was fatal to philosophy, philosophy understood to begin with the discovery of nature. This is simply a blunder when it comes to understanding Nazism and the kingdom of hell known as Auschwitz. In Nazism, historismus combined with the influence of a new and improved discovery of nature, Darwinian natural history. While German historicism seemed to progress into a relativism that supposed that humanity lacks a fixed nature or permanent norms, what actually happened is that Darwinism informed new intellectual standards for measuring human behavior. Nazism was not the product of a radical historicist contention that history is a completely meaningless and subjective process, it was the product of a German interpretation and assimilation of a new natural right based on Darwinian evolution. Nazism can thus be viewed as an attempt to generate the best regime according to biological nature. And this means that the Nazi regime was an expression or form of natural right. Hitler's ethic was based on a Darwinian-based form of natural right. If not Strauss himself, then some who claim influence by Strauss, especially among the so-called neoconservatives, are inclined to a return to Plato or even a kind of Platonic revolution for liberal democracy. Yet if the natural basis of the ancient polis was kin selection, and the Nazis reinvented a new form of the ancient polis on a comparable natural basis, I very much doubt that this is the return to nature they have been searching for. Eternalism, as posited by Strauss, implies there is no evolution. Eternity is an antithesis of evolution. Eternity is implicitly anti-Darwinian. To posit eternity as such is to posit an unchanging essence, nature, or idea in opposition to the historical or genealogical approach of German historismus that Darwinism almost effortlessly undergirded. It is not too hard to see that hiding under the historicism that Strauss attacks is the evolutionary notion that nature changes over time. Strauss's return to ancient political philosophy is one long rationalization of the avoidance of Darwin. Strauss's genuine achievement is thus limited by his failure to confront Darwin's demolition of the notion of an eternal human nature. I suggest using Darwin and evolution like a historical hammer to smash this Platonic Straussian illusion of eternity. While modern natural right may be historically rooted in a reduced form of Anglo-Saxon nationalism, modern human rights cannot be reduced to this origin alone. The individualism of modern rights cannot be understood without Darwin precisely because modern individual selfishness subverts the pre-modern altruism rooted in kin selection. Modern individual right has a general human evolutionary basis in transition to post-biological evolution, even as Nazism demonstrates a real attempt to return to biological evolution. The fuller significance of modern individual right might possibly be realized in political God AI that forms relationships with individual humans over an individual's bond to human community. What is the ultimate meaning of eternity for Strauss? Eternity is a state of perfection, a state that evolution may reach towards without ever fulfilling. I do think that the riddle of the meaning of eternity for Strauss is to be found in the refutation of eternity. Strauss posited the existence of certain eternal philosophical problems. Is the conflict between reason and revelation eternally insoluble? Is this the true eternal Jewish problem? Will a solution to the theological political problem ever be found? Is the theological political problem a truly eternal problem? If progress has not made on this problem, then progress has not been made in a fundamental, philosophic sense since Plato. The very notion of eternal problems flies in the face of mindless modern assumptions of progress. Yet the only way to truly prove Strauss wrong, in a sense, is to prove that these problems are not eternal by finding an ultimate solution. I propose that the possibility of the solution to the theological political problem is to be found in the possibilities of the technological singularity. And this means that the joke is eternally on Strauss. Strauss was partly right that the ancients had uncovered insights that surpassed the moderns, including moderns such as Strauss himself. The pre-modern esoteric biblical wisdom that was over the heads of the original moderns was also over the head of Strauss. It is a testament to Strauss's philosophic integrity that he refused to conflate the conflict between Athens and Jerusalem before history had evolved towards the opening of the solution.